Hey, what is up guys? Kolst here bringing you this dual class drafting tutorial. So it's definitely an exciting time in the tavern right now and in the arena world, as dual class is the time that happens once a year, right? It's only been going for I think 10 days or so as of recording this video, so it's still very fresh. There's a lot of things still figuring things out, but I figure I should make this video as soon as possible. I figured out a decent amount and been averaging about the 9 win mark so far, so I might as well pass on some of that knowledge to you guys. Hope it'll be helpful to you guys. Before we get too far, just want to thank everyone. We just hit 1,000 subscribers recently, which is really cool. Great achievement for all of us, right? So thanks a lot again for that. Alright, so the plan I have for this is I'm going to start out by talking about the class selection, how, and if you're not aware exactly, I'll explain how it works with 2 heroes and exactly what the implications of that are. And then I'll talk a bit about the drafting and a little bit about the meta towards the end. Alright, so first of all, let's talk about how exactly the dual class selection works. So as I'm sure most people are probably aware by now, you pick 2 heroes instead of 1, right? So there is a difference between picking like warrior and then druid versus druid and then warrior. There are actually a few differences. So the important thing to remember about the first hero is that the first hero you pick controls the discover pool. And it may also determine, this isn't entirely figured out, but it seems to also have a very heavy effect on the card quality that you're offered. And that's going to be dependent on, Blizzard does internal balancing to determine which class is better than the other. So it's very important that you just pick essentially the best class first. But we'll get more into that later. And you can go by HS Replay win rates or something. hsreplay.net is a great resource for a lot of statistics around Arena. And then the second hero doesn't have nearly as much impact except for the fact that you get the hero power, which can be very big, right? So you generally will lean towards classes that have good hero powers rather than just the ones that might have the best cards. But we'll talk about that a lot later. So just taking a look at what HS Replay looks like right now. Keep in mind these numbers could change. Right now you have a pretty clear number 1, number 2 for Priest and Warrior for the first pick. This is all for the first pick, by the way. It doesn't properly display any stats really for the second pick, at least externally. And then you have the kind of like pickable heroes, Shaman, I think, being the best of them, and then Druid, Hunter, Paladin. And then you have all the heroes you really don't want to pick, being Rogue, Mage, Warlock, Demon Hunter, aka the classes that have the best hero power. So it kind of makes sense from Blizzard then. They tend to do this every year where the classes that have good hero powers get nerfed into the ground so that they're not everywhere, right? It makes sense. But they are good second picks, but we'll get into that later. So essentially, if you're just trying to win, you pretty much just want to go down this list. You might make some alterations, like if it's close, you can favor, based off your preference or whatever, but you want to roughly go by this list. So as I've said, the first pick isn't too interesting, really. You just want to pick the second class. The second pick, it then becomes a little bit more interesting depending on what you're offered, because then you want to consider a lot more based off of various kinds of synergies you have with the first class. And there are a lot of different synergies you want to consider. You want to consider synergies between mechanics, between just classes covering each other's weaknesses, and in general, just classes that share a common game plan. I'll explain each of those individually. And since the data isn't really widely available, it's really hard. There isn't such a clear tier list for second pick like there is for first pick. And I think a lot of these synergies really impact which one you want to choose. So the first example is these mechanic synergies. What I mean by this is there are certain mechanics, like an example I'm going to use here is Brittlebone Destroyer, where if you include like a different class or different hero powers, these certain cards just get really, really good. So for example, Brittlebone Destroyer, say you have it with Demon Hunter or Rogue especially, for example. These classes, you get to trigger Brittlebone Destroyer for 0 or 1 mana on your turn. Just things you're not supposed to be able to do. It was good enough in Warlock and Priest, right? But now it's even better in these combinations, right? There are certain synergies around attacking the heroes. I don't know. There's a lot of things I could list off, but, there's too many to really talk about right now, but just keep these kinds of things in mind. There's other synergies with Outcast. Well, specifically for Demon Hunter, one of the reasons why I think Demon Hunter is so damn low in the win rates is because they do have these weapon attack synergies and soul fragment synergies and all these other things, even including Outcast if you have class that has heavier cards makes it hard to outcast. There's just so many synergies you lose out on because you're not a demon hunter, and especially as first pick, you don't have that demon hunter hero power. This makes it really rough. So don't pick demon hunter first. Another type of synergy you want to consider is tribal synergies, and I mean like dragon synergies, beast synergies. That's pretty much it right now, but so it's pretty much those two, I'm pretty sure. But mainly the dragon synergies you want to think about are like between the explorer classes, basically druid, priest, hunter, especially mage to a lesser extent. And I guess there's some like beast synergies between like hunter, druid. I know that's a fun combination. I don't think I've done it actually yet, but I've seen people have had fun with that combination. So it's another thing to consider. And then the third type of synergy you want to consider is just classes that generally work together well and potentially cover each other's weaknesses. So this can mean a lot of different things. Like you might want to, pick classes that tend to want to go for the same playstyle. Something I'll talk about later. I think a really big mistake people make in this meta is they don't really draft with a game plan in mind. And you don't necessarily need to have a game plan in mind, pick one of the draft. But you need to figure out at a certain point whether you're going to be like a mid-range deck, a control deck, an aggro deck. And that's always important in Arena, but it's like especially important now because if you just kind of do kind of meh everything, it really doesn't work right now. You really need to have a direction. Keep that in mind, especially if you're going to, pick Hunter or some of these other aggressive classes, like Rogue or slower classes like Priest, Mage. You want to just make sure you're doing something that makes sense. And as I touched on earlier, another big part of that is covering weaknesses. So there are certain classes that have very vulnerable and are very vulnerable and very exploitable because they can't do certain things. Like a really good example is Druid if they get far off board, and even Warrior in Arena since they don't have all their board clears typically. They can't, once they fall behind, they're basically screwed, right? They just can't really do anything. But you have other classes that have all these huge comeback cards like Mage, Warlock, Priest, Shaman. So you can keep in mind that, you mix these two classes that have this weakness with classes that do not have this weakness. You get to basically cover, and you can be much better prepared for any situation, especially if you want to reach like high wins, like 12 wins. You want to try to have decks that are more flexible, unless you really have a really good aggressive or control play style. It's going to be much more consistent to be flexible. And the flip side of that is if you know that, and it's a thing you can consider, right? You can choose to pick like Druid and Hunter, two classes that do not come back from board. You just have to understand, well, that means I need to make a deck that does not fall behind on board because everyone else is going to have comeback mechanics and you're not. So you're going to be limited to, Rusty Raider, Shavar, that type of stuff. But you probably would just want to be, at that point, going for a much more aggressive strategy. Unless you completely high roll your deck. Again, we'll talk more about the draft later. So just to talk about some like actual specific synergies rather than being kind of vague, like a couple synergies I really like. I already mentioned adding comeback potential from Shaman or Mage or Warlock to Druid, for example. But another example is Shaman has a really good class, but just generally doesn't have the card drawer generation to keep up. So if you can give it the card drawer generation from like Mage or Warlock also, becomes a really good combo. And also Priest, being one of the best classes, its really only weakness is that it sometimes struggle to get on board initially. So if you can pick something like Rogue or Demon Hunter to just basically win you the board automatically, it becomes very hard to lose with Priest. Those are some really good synergies. Also, another very significant synergy is if you have a class that kind of lacks healing, like for example, Rogue, Mage, or Warlock, or the hero powers from Rogue or Warlock, and you can pick a class that has healing, like Priest or Druid or Shaman or even Paladin, it's another nice synergy there. And I don't think I want to make this video hours long, so I'm not going to go over every possible synergy possible, but in general, I'm just kind of give ideas somewhat of the kinds of things you can think about, because really everything's not figured out. I might at some point do a video which would be kind of more for fun and less serious, where I just go through like every possible combination, say my thoughts, and whether it's like, but I don't know. We'll see about that. I will mention there's some, you want to equally think about synergies that might not be so good. For example, if you combination I found was really weak was Warrior and Priest, even though they're the top 2 classes on the stats right now. It's just that Warrior mechanics and Priest mechanics, like, you're just trying to do different things. Warrior likes damage things, Priest likes healing things. The removals just don't work well together. It just ends up being really awkward. And another synergy I didn't like is like Mage and Warlock together. Like, it's 2 classes. When you have 2 classes that kind of need healing, and then like especially if you're Warlock hero power, you're damaging yourself. But Mage has the card generation, and draw where you don't even need life tap anyway. Like, it's a combination that just doesn't really make any sense. You'd rather combine those classes with something a little bit more defensive or aggressive. And then of course the last consideration you can make is just your playstyle. As I said, I don't think, especially the second pick, doesn't make that big of a difference. Everything seems to work pretty well, so you can really go for whatever you want to do. Obviously, if you like playing control, pick the classes that are good for that. If you like being aggressive, pick the classes that are good for that, right? So possibilities are really open. And since we've touched upon it kind of indirectly a few times, let's get right into the next topic, which is the draft itself. Now, honestly, except for the fact that you're picking cards from 2 classes instead of 1, the draft isn't really all that much different in how you do it now. You know, there's still no buckets, so a lot of times you're just going to be picking the best card that's offered. But there are going to be a few other things you do need to think about. And I don't want to make this video too long again, so I'm going to make a whole nother video at some point, which is like a complete like overall drafting tutorial. But for now, I'll just touch upon like the general rules of pick good cards. You want to value your curve depending on what type of deck you want to value your curve a little bit differently. And it's very important in this meta to have tempo options and flexibility for the most part, unless you really get a bananas aggressive deck or control deck. Generally, you want to go kind of in the middle for consistency. So one major difference that is true right now is that if you're someone who's used to using draft helpers are a bit less reliable right now, so people who have better intuition around cards are gonna benefit, because there are a few things you need to be thinking about in dual class that you normally wouldn't have to be thinking about. Which is, you know, things like, for example, certain cards just don't work in certain classes, and certain cards are absolutely broken in certain classes, or just in dual class in general. So, for example, I mentioned Brillbone Destroyer, right? It's really good if you're like a rogue or a demon hunter. Really bad if you're like a hunter or a paladin, you know, so you want to keep these kinds of things in mind. Also, certain cards like Vendetta and Underbelly Fence are just completely broken because they're almost always active. I think my understanding is that Vendetta actually activates itself. Fence does not, but Vendetta does. So it's literally just a 0 mana deal 4. If you're a rogue second pick, which you should be, you probably don't want to pick rogue first pick almost ever. So, and of course, in general, you no matter what class combination, even if you pick like, you know, Hunter and something else aggressive like Demon Hunter, you might still get control options, but obviously you're probably going to be an aggressive deck, so keep in mind that you want to be going for that kind of a curve. And the other thing to consider is that certain cards are just better depending on what your exact class combination is, or more specifically, what your first hero option is. Because as I mentioned in the very beginning, the first hero controls the discover pool. So that leads you to do some very broken things that you're not really supposed to be able to do. So for example, well, like if your first hero is Priest, your Dragon Lackey, if you can get like Priest Warlock and you get Evil Genius, you get Dragon Lackeys, you know, that kind of thing. But just in general, like any kind of discover, most discovers, you need to be careful about what the actual text on the card is. Because for example, you know, like Twisted Knowledge specifically says Warlock. Evocation specifically says Mage, so it doesn't matter. But most other discovers in the game are from the class. So for example, as I said, there are a lot of different possibilities with this, but in general, like some of the ones off the top of my head that can be really important, like if you can get, as I mentioned, like if you can get a Dragon Discover in something like Priest or Druid, it could be really good. Also, if you can get a Spell Discover in like especially Priest, like a really significant example, if you're a Priest Mage, you get offered Magic Trick, that Magic Trick is a lot better than it normally would be. Not auto pick, but you know, 1 to 3 mana Priest spells are really, really good. So you definitely want to be considering that card. And I think the other thing that's important to mention is you want to keep it you want to keep in mind if you pick classes that have a similar weakness or a weakness that they will not be covering it from themselves as much as normal, then you want to keep that in mind in the strategy you go for. Because a good example would be like if you pick like warrior or warlock specifically, because warrior damages itself and warlock also damages itself. So unless you get like a whole bunch of like the 8 mana lifesteal taunts from warlock, for example, like you're going to be very vulnerable to dying if you ever fall behind on board. So you want to make sure you're going for a strategy that even more than normal, you will not fall off on board. Just things you want to keep in mind there. Oh, and the last thing I want to touch on is there are some certain things you want to think about, because there are some anti-synergies in the game too. There aren't too many things to consider, but a couple ones to think about. Just some fun one is Arcane Amplifier in Warlock. No, don't do that. Don't do that. And the more important synergy that you want to think about is if you mix like weapon classes with like classes that either also have weapons or weapon hero power or a hero power that attacks with their face naturally, like Demon Hunter or Druid. There's some things you need to think about there. So for example, you just want to keep in mind, like, if you pick Warrior and Rogue together, like, you can't use your hero power and your weapons together, so you're not going to get the value there. If you have like a Demon Hunter and a Warrior though, like you can still use the hero power. It's just you can't ping with the hero power, so that sometimes that's good, sometimes, but it's also exploitable. If you equip a big weapon, then your opponent you can't ping, and they know it, so you might need to actually draft more pings. Things to think about. And the result of that, really, I think, is that you might value certain weapons lower. Because I think in general, I've been kind of coming to the conclusion that just playing Demon Hunter in general, like weapons are not as good as they otherwise would be. Like the 4 mana weapon, even though it's basically True Silver, like I think it's worth less than True Silver because of that. So just something you want to keep in mind. And some other obvious ones: don't pick Deadly Poison if you're not a rogue. These kinds of things. All right, and I think that's pretty much all I have to say about the draft. The last piece I want to talk about is the actual meta itself. So the meta right now is, honestly, I play on a bunch of different servers, which I maybe have a clouded view of it because servers tend to have different play styles. But from what I've seen and what I think from other people see too, the meta is kind of all over the place. You have people that just draft like literally like 9/8 drops, and then one game, and then the next game you're gonna play against someone that doesn't have a card that costs more than 3 in their deck, right? So it really is all over the place. So you can kind of do whatever you want. As I've said a couple times in this video, going kind of a mid-range strategy is usually going to be the most consistent, but of course you want to adapt to your draft. But the really important thing there is that you want to figure out much sooner than is usually necessary, and sooner rather than later, that what your win condition is going to be for your deck. Are you going to be that person that has all the aggro tools? Are you going to be that person that has all the slow stuff? Are you going to be that person that is that mid-range deck which just tries to survive half the games and tries to be the aggro deck against the greedier decks, right? You want to understand where you are, and depending on what you do there, that's gonna greatly change how you value certain types of cards. If you're that aggro deck, you really don't want a card that might be that card like Plague Pro-Drake, which might be amazing in a different type of deck. And I'll say just in general, you do want to have that flexibility. So having pings to be able to come back on board if people try to abuse you. If you don't have like the Demon Hunter hero power, it's very valuable. And I've been seeing like this happens every time there's a major meta shift like this. There's people that used to be, used to getting like a certain number of wins, and then they're all of a sudden getting like 1 to 2 wins every run, and they kind of wonder what's going on. And I think this is generally the main cause of that is people, maybe they're used to going for a specific play style, and maybe it worked in the previous meta. Like we just came from, in the beginning of Scholomance Academy, it was very, very much favored control players, and then Mage and Priest got nerfed, and then it became very much a meta that favors tempo players. So if people are used to playing the tempo style and they're forcing the tempo style too hard, it might not work. Or if they were playing in the early expansion and they were used to playing that control style, it also may not work, right? But in general, it's really important to just right now more than ever to just be able to adapt. So the adaptation, I think the primary adaptation I've made in this meta, like the thing that used to work pretty well in the previous meta that does not work now is it used to be you just pick like a bunch of early game and then a whole bunch of like late game drops. The problem with that is if you really there's just a high cost having late game drops right now, it feels like. So even though you want to have you would like to have that value, and the best way, it makes sense to like have a lot of tempo things and then have a few late game cards that win you the game. The problem is if you play an 8 drop, you just get rolled over right now. So you really want to be picky about your late game cards, which isn't, I'm not saying don't pick a Proto Drake, but be very selective there. You want to value higher, really you just want to value cards higher that cost less than like, 4 or 5 mana, because it just gives you more options. And as I've said, like just having more options and being more flexible in this meta is really what seems to provide the most consistency right now. So you really like those value cards that are cheaper, things like Primordial Explorers or whatever, other kinds of Discover effect, rather than just having these clunky cards that might get stuck in your hand. But of course, you still need to keep in mind what strategy you're going for. Yes, if you're drafting a slow deck, you probably will need to pick up some slow cards to have enough size to compete or outvalue decks. You don't want to be in that situation where you have a kind of slow deck, but then you also just get outvalued by an aggro deck because they have better generation than you. You don't want that to happen. So, obviously keep that in mind as well. And I guess the other piece there, something that was important in the last meta too, is if you are playing in a game where it seems like your opponent is the slow deck and you're the fast deck, make sure you play like the fast deck, which basically just means not like full out face, but you want to make sure you're pushing face and pressuring appropriately. You have to understand that the pressure is on you to end the game, so you need to do that, because otherwise you might just there'd be these games where you have no chance of winning if you just keep trading all game, right? So keep that in mind as well. But anyway, I think that's everything I wanted to talk about today. Thanks a lot for hanging out, everyone, and everyone who watched all the way through to the end here. If you have more questions, of course, make sure you can definitely leave them in the comment section below. Don't forget to like and subscribe as well if you have not already. And also, if you have questions, you can also come into my Twitch stream, which I will have linked below as I always do. But anyway, look forward to seeing you guys again. We'll see you next time.